Welcome to Fun with History with your teacher, Professor Banks. Today, we are going to be diving into the beginning of human civilization. And it's a lesson you don't want to miss. So, without any further ado, let's start our lesson this week. The beginning of human civilization. Welcome to the beginning of human civilization, our history lesson this week, as we continue to dive into the progress of our history. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about the ice ages. And the last ice age we talked about was the Pleistocene Ice Age, which you may or may not remember, but it was dated from It ended about 11,700 years ago. So, on this timeline here, hard to see. Okay, it doesn't show up very well. But if you want to look at a timeline, we are starting today at 5500 BC. And 5500 BC would have been, if you consider we're in the year 2016 now, it would have been about, because this was all BC, so you're looking at about 7,500 years ago. So, to put it in perspective, it's still another 4,000 years after the Pleistocene Ice Age. So, all those ice ages, most of them happen all before what we're going to be looking at today, the beginning of human civilization. So let's get into this subject, shall we? The beginning of human civilization. Where did it begin? And where did it begin and who began it all? So, what I want to do is break it up to you. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the first known human civilization. And then we're going to take a look at why these civilizations developed, where they did. And then we also are going to look a little bit at Egypt today. Because Egypt is actually one of the most oldest civilizations in the world. So, that's where our journey begins. But before we do that, of course, we got to have a joke. And I always have an icebreaker joke to share with you. So, here's my joke for this week. And I hope you like it. This is a joke about a duck. Who here likes ducks? Anybody? Ducks? Okay. So this is the joke. A duck goes into a vegetable produce store and says, "Do you have any grapes?" The man says, "No." The duck comes back in an hour and says, "Do you have any grapes?" The man says, "No, I told you I don't have any grapes." The duck comes back in another hour and says, "Do you have any grapes?" The man says, "No, I told you I don't have any grapes." And the man's getting a little frustrated now, and he says, "If you ask me again, I'll nail your tail to the floor." So the duck comes back in another hour and says, "Do you have any nails?" The man says, "No." The duck says, "Do you have any grapes?" Ha ha ha. Anyway, a little bit of an icebreaker joke for you. Hope you like it. Okay, let's start. Let's look at the beginning of human civilization, shall we? And I got my chart here that I've already actually pre-filled out for you. So, let me see if I could get this lined up for you. The beginning of human civilization. And you can see the first line there is 300,000 years ago. Now that is really the number that is thrown out for the beginning of human civilization, but it's very an unproven number. It's not backed up. There's not really any solid historical evidence to back that up. So it's undocumented, really, that 300,000 years is undocumented. But it's really towards the end of the Neolithic period. And now you may ask me, what on earth is the Neolithic period? Let me tell you what that is. Okay, so what the Neolithic period is basically, in plain English, it's the New Stone Age. So what happened in the New Stone Age was stone tools started to be used. Things that, people could use to help them in their everyday survival, basically. And so the New Stone Age was characterized by new stone tools, very high dependence on domesticated plants or animals for survival, and you started to see some appearance of crafts such as pottery and weaving. That is what was happening in the New Stone Age. So if you go back to what I showed you earlier with the 300,000 years undocumented beginning of human civilization, basically you could almost sum this up in the fact that it was really the modern day version of Survivor. Okay, so what was happening in that 300,000 years ago is, as much as historians can tell anyway, and as I said, there's not a lot of proof for it, but the people that were living were moving from place to place, and they're basically, what they were doing was they were hunting for food, they were building crude shelters, and they were trying to protect themselves from wild animals, so they kept moving from place to place to place to place. And this is in this 300,000 year ago time frame and the end of the Neolithic period. So that was what was happening then. So what developed from that point on, as the Neolithic period ended, and some kind of people were out there and they were moving from place to place. When I talk about the beginning of human civilization, I'm talking about where you can actually start to see people develop and people living in a society, kind of. That is what I'm talking about. So, what we have to do first of all is, apologize, give me a minute here as I look at my notes. So the first, I'm going to take you to 5500 BC, okay? So the first known knowledge of an area, it was called Egypt, okay? And everybody knows where Egypt is. Egypt is in the top corner of Africa, and it's a very old country, and that's why it's on a lot of people's lists of places to go see, because it's so old and historical. But basically, that is the first known knowledge of an area, 5500 BC, called Egypt, divided into Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. Very creative terminology there, but essentially that's what it was. So that was the first known knowledge of an area called Egypt. Now, what happened after that is we got an area called Mesopotamia. Okay, so Mesopotamia, and I'm going to show this to you on a map here. Mesopotamia was essentially, Mesopotamia is modern day Iraq. So that's where it was located geographically. And this is Mesopotamia, a little bit more better for you to see here. Okay, so I think you can see that map somewhat well. So you can see this Mesopotamia area. You can see a lot of water there. So there's two major rivers going through it, and one of the rivers called the Euphrates rivers, and one of them is called the Tigris River, and those rivers are still present there today in modern day Iraq. But that was Mesopotamia, and so I'm going to tell you why Mesopotamia was where it was. Now, maybe a student has an answer for that. Why do you think Mesopotamia was where it was? And why do you think that was one of the areas where humans first became a civilization that we know of? Professor, over here, I know. Okay, what's your answer there? I think they developed in that area because there was a lot of water. Is that correct? Very good answer. Yes. That is a major reason why a civilization started to develop in that Mesopotamia area, because of those two major rivers that were there. And they developed in that area because they needed water for drinking, and they also very, very important for the crops too, because that is how they were nourishing and making their food, by crops. So it was a very, very nice area to kind of start to develop because of that water there and those rivers, and it was very, very useful for drinking and for building up their crops. So they settled near rivers, the early human civilization. And as I said before, it was established between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and it is now known as the nation of Iraq. So again, I'm going to show you another map, just to show you. So here now is Iraq. Can you see that? Yeah. So I'm pointing right here. This is Iraq here. And you can see on this map, there's still the Euphrates rivers, and there's still Tigris rivers up here. So that was Mesopotamia back in the day, and that is where we got our first known human civilization. Does anybody have any idea what the name of the first human civilization was? Any ideas? They had a really cool name. They were the Sumner people. Sumner people. They're my kind of people. Summer people. Except it was spelled S-U-M-E-R, not S-U-M-M-E-R. But that was the first known civilization. And that's what they were called, the Summer people. And they were the first humans to form a civilization. And they did it in that Mesopotamia region that I showed you on the map. So basically, everything were basically the beginnings of human civilization all trace back to the Egypt area and Iraq area of today. That is where it started to develop. And now you look at Egypt, you wonder why Egypt was such a predominant place for human civilization to start to, and it was a very prominent area as well. Well, the geography of Egypt, very similar to Mesopotamia, where Egypt has lots of water that goes through it too. And let me try to show you, see if I can bring up, just bear with me here. See if I could show you Egypt here. Now, I know many of you know where Egypt is, but and here is a good map of Egypt here, right here. So you can see there Egypt. There's Upper Egypt, and down here is Lower Egypt, like I told you before. And there's the Red Sea right there beside Egypt. And Egypt also has a couple of rivers that go through it. And one of the major rivers that go through it is the Nile River. So basically the Egyptian people, that area was a very good area to develop for human civilization to first develop to, because of all the water that was there. Very similar to Mesopotamia, where they had access to the water, had the access to it for drinking and for growing their crops. So Egypt also started to be an area where we know human civilization developed. So now, Egypt was brought together under one ruler called King Narmer. King Narmer. And he really was the king that brought Egypt together and really started that beginning of the Egyptian civilization. And that was, Egypt starts to become a force around 3200 BC. Okay? 3200 BC. I got it here. Or 3300 BC, actually. So 3300 BC is when you start to see Egypt become a force. You start to see Egypt become a society. And one of the things I want to talk about to you about Egypt is the things that Egypt are known for. And first of all, Egypt had a solar calendar. So one of the big things about the Egyptian civilization is they were huge into astronomy. They had a solar calendar. They went by the stars and in the sky. And that's kind of how they lived their life. They just kind of thought that astronomy was the direction for life and was the source for giving the major answers to life. So that was one big thing that the Egyptians were known for. And they also, and this is 3000 BC, what the Egyptians started to do was build something very big and very large. And again, I pose the question, does anybody know what the Egyptians were known for building that was large and big? Professor, back here, Professor. Yes, student. Oh, you over there. What would be the answer to that question? The pyramids, right? Exactly, the pyramids. So, in 3000 BC, the Egyptians started to build great pyramids. And now, what is the history beyond of the pyramids? What is the significance of those? Why did they do that? Well, first of all, what you need to know about Egypt is the rulers of Egypt were called pharaohs. Pharaohs. And they were basic, and because of being so close to water, especially the Nile River, and what happened with the Nile River is it flooded a lot. So when it flooded, the land obviously became very moist, very wet, and very conducive to growth of crops and food. So when this happened, they were able to have a lot of food. And because they had a great source of food, that led to them becoming more wealthier. Because they were able to basically sell that food and make money on it. Now, of course, back then they didn't have a money system like we do now, but because of that river and because of the river flooding a lot and causing the land to be very conducive to growing, that led to them being very wealthy as well. So these pharaohs were very wealthy. They had large palaces, and Pharaoh actually, if you look at it in the English version, if you translate it, it literally means big house. So the pharaohs were wealthy. They had huge places where they lived. And because of this, the pyramids were designed because the pharaohs wanted a sacred place to go when they died. So that's why these pyramids were created. They were designed for the pharaohs to go into after they died, and they were designed to preserve and protect their body. Now these pyramids were made very strong. Make no doubt about it. They were made of very heavy stone, and they were intended to last forever. And they were built as tombs for the pharaohs and for their queens. So the queens were essentially their wives, the people they married. Now, the pharaohs were buried in pyramids of many different shapes and sizes. And today, in Egypt, there are still about 80 pyramids present there today. So a lot of people, who love history they want to go over to Egypt to see the pyramids because they're such a historical thing to see. Now, you go over there now and see the pyramids, you're not going to find any bodies in there, because what happened sometime after these pyramids were built and the pharaohs were put into them after they passed away, many of them got robbed, unfortunately. So what happened, because I think what you had happening was people were very interested in getting something for the things that were on the pharaohs. So obviously the pharaohs were very well decorated. They had jewelry on them, and they had very elegant things on them. So a lot of people robbed their tombs in order to get their hands on those things. So basically, now you're not going to find any bodies in those pyramids now today. But back then, it was a very, very big thing to build these pyramids so that the pharaohs' bodies could be preserved and protected. And obviously, hindsight being, they weren't protected well enough, because they were robbed for the valuable things they had on them. So So what's another, and we also want to touch on another thing that Egypt brings to our history and brings to our culture today, is really they developed the first real system of writing. So what they did back then, how they wrote back then, is they wrote in a form what was known and called hieroglyphics. How many have heard of that term, hieroglyphics? It's obviously, I've heard of that term, and I'm sure many people have. So it was a system of writing back then, and what this system did was used a set of pictures showing common objects such as a human eye or a hand, and those and they used these set of pictures, and back then they completely understood what it was saying. They just knew, we would look at it today and probably wouldn't make tails or any heads or tails or sense out of it. But back then, when they used these set of pictures, the Egyptians knew exactly what was being written at that time. So they really developed the first system of writing, which ultimately led to the first alphabet, which we will look at in future history lessons. And the first alphabet will be coming out of the land of the Greeks, and that's going to be something we dive into next week, Greece. But that's basically, Egypt is one of the oldest civilizations around, and it's something that is important to touch on just for these simple little facts I brought forward. Now, basically, this human civilization got an early start in Egypt, and then it from Egypt, they kind of spread. So, Aksum was a place where human civilization progressed to, and Aksum is in northern Ethiopia now. And Kush is another place where you start to see various civilizations begin to rise in various cradles, and we're talking from around 3300 BC. And Kush is in the ancient Africa. And then you see them much later in sub-Saharan Africa as well. So when you look at the beginning of human civilization, you got to center your focus on the areas of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And that's where really the first documented human civilization began. And in Mesopotamia, it was the Sumer people that developed. And then you had the Egyptians in Egypt. And the pharaohs were a very strong people in Egypt. Very wealthy people and very strong leaders in that time. I think this is everything on the beginning of human civilization that you need to be aware of. So, one last thing. If you go ahead to 1792 BC, okay, so I want to keep the timeline progressing. Babylon has to be, you have to note Babylon as a major civilization and power at the time as well, because Babylon was actually the capital of Mesopotamia. So, and there was a king that came out of Babylon who developed something very, very important that I'm sure most of us have studied in some form in school today. And I'll just give you the king's name and you'll be able to know exactly what I'm talking about. So, there's a king in Babylon called King Hammurabi, which is where we got the Code of Hammurabi from. So, the Code of Hammurabi is significant because it's the oldest written law in the world. So that's really our first real written law that we have to go to when we study the significance of law in our society today. And it was a very basic, simple code, very basic, simple law. And basically the essence of this code of Hammurabi was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Okay, so if you had something done to you by somebody, the punishment was that that person should have the same thing done to them. It was called the Code of Hammurabi. It's a very interesting code if you start to get into it and study it, but that came from Mesopotamia. That came from Babylon in 1792 BC. So that's a significant thing to be aware of too. And I actually had a chance, 3 years ago, I was on my honeymoon in France, and one of the places I went to was Paris for a week. And when I was in Paris, obviously, spent a day going to the Louvre, the huge, huge museum they have in Paris. And one of the sections I went through was a lot of ancient, historical antiques that they had in there. And one of the things they had in there was the Code of Hammurabi on the wall, something you could look at and kind of read. So I found that very interesting when I was going through the Louvre in Paris to come across that. But anyway, that is, in essence, the beginning of human civilization as we look at those major areas and people that we look at. Now, what we're going to see next week is we're going to see that another area starts to rise up and become a very major historical significance and a very major power when you look at the history of the world, and that being Greece. So next week in our history lesson, we're going to take a walk into Greece, and hopefully for any of you out there who are from Greece or who have Greece origins, you'll find that lesson very interesting. And we'll probably spend a couple of weeks at least on Greece, because lots of things happen in that era where Greece came onto the scene. So, I hope you enjoyed this week's history lesson, and I hope that you enjoyed learning about the beginning of human civilization and where it began and why it began where it did. And then we're just going to keep moving forward in our history lessons as we go through different time frames, and looking forward to it. And by the way, please feel free to leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. If you like these videos, if you find them interesting, and if you find that you're learning something, and hopefully you are. So until next week, this is your professor, Professor Banks, talking history. And until next week, take care. And join us next week as we take a walk into ancient Greece. Until next week, bye.